Okay, just want to bring you in for the final video of the rewiring of the battery room. You saw in the last video we covered how we consolidated all the external solar panels down to two FlexMax 80s. You see here the main DC wiring panel, as well as the two breakers you see there that allow you to disconnect the DC or the battery side of the FlexMax charge controllers. Now, the only change that we've done since the last video is that we added some additional capacity in the bank of 16 of these 135 amp hour cells you see here. We came across a really good price on these on eBay. We went ahead and took a chance on it. Good seller reputation, excellent communication. So far the cells have been working out fine. No issues. We've been running them for, I would say, the last week on this bank. But the system in general, as you can notice from the last time we posted a video, we've been running the system for probably right about 2 to 3 weeks at this point. Just kind of getting the charge controllers dialed in to deal with lithium iron phosphate. No issues there. I've just been making some minor tweaks. And I'll put a link to his blog post, or I shouldn't say his blog post, but his forum, as well as his channel in the description. But his name is Will, and I don't want to try to pronounce the last name, but you'll see it in the description. In his forum post, he has some excellent write-ups on where to set your charge controllers when dealing with lithium batteries. And I was happy to see that the numbers that we settled upon based on the characteristics of those controllers, and again, it was keeping an eye on the batteries throughout the course of the day, on sunny days and cloudy days, and keeping an eye on the Batrium BMS and how it stated the condition of the cells were, and then making the appropriate adjustments on those charge controllers as far as float, rebulk, and charge time in general. And like I say, we've got them dialed in where it's pretty comfortable at this point, where it'll do a bulk charging cycle right up to the point you start to see the long mons go into a bypass state, and then shortly after that starts to happen, and you see all the cells starting to come up to their max point or their charge set point. Then we've got the controllers dialed in pretty good at this point, where they then go into silent mode. One thing a lot of individuals have posted, that lithium ion phosphate or lithium batteries in general do not like to be floated. So one of the things that we've done after some research and seeing how others have set up their charge controllers, we have our float and our rebulk set to the same value. So the charge controllers in this case never go into a float situation. Once the charge controllers have hit the absorption set point in the controller, they go into silent status at that point. They will not go into another charge cycle until we've hit that rebulk set point. So they won't sit there and float. Unlike traditional lead acid, where they were set up with a float set point and it would get the batteries charged and then hold them at that level. Lithium iron phosphate, in my understanding, a lot of individuals have said, do not float them. They do not like to be floated. So we've, in a sense, have adjusted our charge controllers appropriately. Nothing with the Batrium has changed since the last video. Again, the big change was just adding some additional capacity. We were up to 515 amp hours at this point. I've seen a couple individuals in their other video postings as well had a question with their Batrium as to whether they can be plugged into the USB port and be powered off an external. I'm not suggesting you try this with your setup. I know it was an unanswered question. I have done this now for several weeks and it's been fine. But if you remember in the previous videos, we're using this 48 volt to 24 volt DC to DC converter to provide power to the Batrium. But you'll notice we're also plugged in via USB cable. That comes down here to a Generation 1 surface that you can see here. You can see that you see all 64 cells that make up four strings of 16 cells apiece. And you'll notice, you can probably see it here, the Batrium voltage is 24.2 volts. So at least in this case, and I'm using a Watchmon 4, it seems to know that it's plugged into an external power supply and uses that in lieu of the power it could get off the USB port. But it still uses the USB port for communication. Now the Batrium 4 does have wireless ability, and I've seen other people use it, and it works fine for them. I did try it here, and one thing I noticed either with this, also with this Surface, as well as another laptop, the refresh rate, at least for what I wanted to see out of it, and it could very well be my wireless router, I do need to update it, but the refresh rate was kind of laggy. It was a little bit jerky. Like you wouldn't see a nice smooth update of information that you see here. It would kind of jump and jerk a little bit and pause and then do one big update. It just seemed to be, like I said, a little glitchy. So we had this first gen Surface not really being used for anything at this point. So what we have done is that, again, we're plugged into USB port. We've got the software loaded up on here, and then we just access it via remote desktop from another machine. So it gave us the ability to take a device that wasn't really being utilized and utilize it for this purpose. It's only running the Batrium software. It has literally no issue at all running this piece. And with it being plugged into USB, at least for my particular setup, I get a lot smoother data updates and a lot better response out of it for my case. But going back to the original question, at least for what I'm doing here, my Watchmon seems perfectly content with, again, running off that 48 volt to 24 volt DC to DC converter you saw on the wall, but also being plugged into USB at the same time. Again, I'm not suggesting that you try this with your setup, but I did take a chance here. I tried it on this one, and it seems to work. Not seems, but it does work with no issue. We went through and secured our wiring down a little bit. You can see the protected cable clamps on it. A lot of our cabling that you saw in the previous videos, we did go through and put through this nylon braided jacket. And at this point, will be the bulk of the changes completed. What we may do in the future is just add an additional capacity as we can, but with 515 amp hours of capacity, it puts us really, really close to what we were running when we had the AGM sealed lead acids. So we're going to run the system in this configuration for a little while, and like I said, we may add additional capacity to it in the future, or we may not. Like I said, time will tell. Again, no issues running the lithium batteries with our Outback inverter that you see there. Again, this is the 8,000 watt inverter. It's made up of two 4,000 watt inverters inside the cabinet. These, if you remember, were the Midnight Solar surge suppressors, or it shouldn't say surge, I should say transient suppressors. One on the input power from the grid and one on the output power of the inverter itself. And again, the reason why we're using this particular inverter is it gives you the nice ability to blend the solar power that you can generate along with grid power. So if you're in a situation where it's a cloudy day and you can generate some solar, but maybe not enough to handle all the loads, I can blend the two. I can go in the settings and say, for example, okay, of all my AC loads, take 2 or 3 amps, pull that off of solar and pull the rest off grid, and it will mix the two together. Like I said, very nice, very flexible unit. Right now in the evening hours, what I will normally do is put this in UPS mode, meaning it will just kind of stay in standby. It runs all the loads off grid power, but in the event of power failure, then it will function like an UPS, like a computer UPS would be. It'll immediately start drawing off batteries, the power to critical loads. One thing that we did do, if you remember, in this breaker box here were our DC breakers for the battery side of our charge controllers. We did upgrade those to 100 amp breakers. If you remember in the previous video, we got 80 amp breakers, but we had all the covers off for a good couple of weeks, just monitoring the system, checking for hot spots, things of that nature. And one thing we noticed on those breakers, and it could have been a defect with the breaker. One of the two breakers, we're unsure, but just to be on the safe side, with that breaker only pushing about 40 amps through it. In other words, the charge controller was outputting 40 amps out of 80 possible to charge the batteries. It was getting fairly warm, warmer than I'm comfortable with. So we pulled the 80 amp breakers out, upgraded to 100. Now, the reason, I know you might look at that and say, well, why were you reusing 80 amp breakers to begin with? You know, you should always factor about 20% free space in there. And if you're running an 80 amp charge controller, what happens when it outputs 80 amps? Well, that's an excellent question, but the way the solar panels in the house are configured, and seeing as we have two 80 amp charge controllers for the entire panel array, it's split half and half. These charge controllers will never output their full rated current. That's why we went with 80 amp breakers originally. But with that breaker only having half its capacity pushed through it, and it was about 40, little over half, about 40, 42 amps, that breaker was getting noticeably warm, almost hot to the touch. So again, could have been an issue with the breaker, but to be on the safe side, since those breakers are really only there to protect in case something happens to the charge controller and it shorts out its battery side, and also to give us the ability to turn off or disconnect the DC side from the charge controller, we went ahead and upgraded them to 100 amp just to give them the extra headroom, and it has solved the issue. We monitored it for the last couple of days, in which the charge controllers would push out about a maximum of about 42 to 43 amps. Same conditions as before when we were running the 80 amp breakers, and they were room temperature to the touch. So no further issue noted there. And that's really been the only item that we've noticed with the ReWire, was just those breakers getting a little bit warm. Again, we upgraded them and they've been fine. Absolutely no issue with the Batrium in its current configuration. It's been running flawlessly 24/7. Plugged into that Surface, first generation Surface Pro. And the batteries themselves, the first string of batteries that we had in, if you remember, these are 180 amp hour prismatic cells. The two strings of the Fortune 100 amp hour cells, you got one string here and another string behind it. You can see the lights on the long mons. And then the most recent addition, these are the company name is TAFEL 135 amp hour cells that you see here. And you can see that these are, you know, size wise and weight wise are considerably smaller than their brethren behind it. Now these are a little bit bigger. These are 180 amp hours, but these are 135. They're not too much smaller in capacity, but a lot smaller in size. Other than that, the setup is the same. You can see each cell has a long mon, and you can see that we even went through, as you saw in the previous videos, and nylon wrapped our communications cable. But wiring wise, it's a lot simpler in here than it was before, and we've got pretty much the same capacity and a smaller footprint, and everything's been, so far, knock on wood, running like a top. And we'll bring you back and do follow-up videos as time progresses to kind of show you what's going on with the lithium iron phosphate batteries, how they're handling over time, and definitely as if we add capacity to this or if we make other changes to this, we'll make some follow-up videos as well. But other than that, I'll talk to you later. Bye.